My stepson accidentally called me mom in front of his birth mother and she accused me of stealing her child. She didn't expect him to defend me instead. Laura's face went white, then red, then crumpled completely. Other parents stared as she rushed toward the bathroom, shoulders shaking. Jacob looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. What was I supposed to do? Correct him in front of his judges? 2 years earlier, I married Michael, a divorced dad with the sweetest kid imaginable, Jacob. He was 10 when I entered their lives. Quiet but curious, with Michael's dark eyes and a smile that could melt hearts. I'd been single for years, focused on my marketing career, never thinking about kids until I fell for both of them. Michael's ex-wife Laura lived 3 hours away. She saw Jacob every other weekend. Standard custody stuff. Their divorce had been messy. She'd felt Michael prioritized work over family, while he felt suffocated by her need to control every household decision. They'd worked hard to stay civil for Jacob's sake. Laura was an ER nurse, dedicated to saving lives but often working shifts that conflicted with her custody weekends. She'd grown up bouncing between divorced parents herself, never quite belonging anywhere. Her own stepmother had been cold and distant, treating her like an unwelcome reminder of her father's previous marriage. Understanding her background helped explain the intensity. Laura had sworn she'd never let another woman treat her child the way she'd been treated. At the time, Michael thought she was being dramatic. Looking back, it was the first warning sign that she saw any stepmother as an automatic threat. The thing that mattered most to me was making Jacob feel secure and loved. I'd heard step-parent horror stories, trying too hard or not enough, so I was determined to let our relationship develop naturally. Never pushed him to call me anything specific, never tried to replace his mom, just focused on being a safe adult who genuinely cared. But there was this tiny detail that should have been my first warning. Every custody exchange, Laura made subtle comments about his clothes, haircut, backpack, anything suggesting I'd had input in his daily life. His hair looks different, she'd say, running fingers through it. I usually take him to my stylist who knows exactly how he likes it. New shoes got noticed too. I always buy his sneakers a half size bigger because I understand how fast his feet grow. The comments weren't mean-spirited, just pointed enough to establish that she knew things about her son I was still learning. She'd ask about homework in ways that suggested she knew his teacher's expectations better than anyone else. When he mentioned enjoying meals I'd cooked, she'd nod politely but remind him about the special dinner they'd made, just the two of them, the previous weekend. At first I brushed it off as normal protective mom instincts. Laura had been Jacob's primary parent before the divorce. It made sense she'd noticed changes in his routine. I figured she was adjusting to sharing parental responsibilities with someone new. But the comments got more pointed as months passed. When Jacob mentioned I'd helped with his science project, Laura made sure to tell him she'd helped with all his previous projects and knew exactly what teachers expected. When he came home excited about a recipe we'd tried, she'd remind him of all the special meals they used to make as a family. It felt like territorial marking, making sure Jacob understood I was temporary while she was permanent. Then a second thing happened that complicated everything. Jacob started opening up to me about things he'd never discussed with Michael. School drama with kids who excluded him from lunch tables, friendship problems with his best friend who'd started hanging with older kids, worries about whether he was smart enough for advanced math. I became his safe space for growing up conversations, partly because I was female and could offer perspectives Michael couldn't, partly because I was newer to his life, without the complicated history that builds up between parents and children over years. Michael was thrilled Jacob felt comfortable talking to me, especially about topics that made him embarrassed. But it created an interesting dynamic where I was becoming more integrated into his emotional support system than typical step-parents. When he had nightmares, he'd knock on our door asking for me specifically. When nervous about presentations, he'd ask me to help him practice because I didn't make him as nervous as Dad did. He never called me Mom during this period, usually just used my first name or didn't call me anything when he needed attention. But our bond was deepening in ways that felt natural and healthy. I started attending soccer games and school events, cheering from sidelines and taking photos to send Michael when work kept him away. Other parents assumed I was Jacob's mother, making conversation about our kids and parenting strategies. I'd politely correct them. I was his stepmother, but many didn't see much difference. Meanwhile, Laura's comments were escalating beyond casual observations. She started questioning Jacob about our conversations. What did we talk about when Michael wasn't around? Was I giving advice about things he should discuss with her instead? When Jacob mentioned I'd helped him understand some growing up questions he felt embarrassed to ask his dad about, Laura had a 45-minute phone call with Michael about appropriate boundaries. She argued that certain discussions should wait until Jacob was with her, where she could provide the correct information and context. The conversation got heated. Michael pointed out that kids don't schedule questions around custody arrangements, and that Jacob was clearly benefiting from having another trusted adult to talk to. But I could tell the criticism was wearing on him. He started seeming stressed during exchanges, carefully monitoring conversations to avoid drama. I tried staying out of the conflict. When Laura made passive-aggressive comments about my involvement, I'd smile politely and redirect to neutral topics. When she questioned my decisions during Michael's custody time, I'd defer to him and let him handle explanations even when I felt like hired help instead of family. The stress affected my relationship with Jacob too. I became overly careful about social media photos that included him, knowing Laura scrutinized everything. I second-guessed simple decisions like extra weekend bedtime or after-school ice cream, wondering how she'd interpret these choices. Michael noticed my increasing caution and asked if I was okay. I explained that every interaction with Jacob felt evaluated and judged, making it hard to be natural and spontaneous. He was frustrated that Laura's behavior was affecting our family dynamics, but concerned about escalating conflict by addressing it too directly. Maybe I was overreacting to what felt like constant scrutiny. That's what I told myself when Laura started texting Michael detailed questions about Jacob's routine whenever he was with us. Bedtime, breakfast, homework help, teacher contact, outdoor time. At first, Michael answered thoroughly, viewing her attention as admirable parenting even if excessive. He'd dealt with Laura's intense involvement in every aspect of Jacob's life since before their divorce, learning to provide information without getting defensive. But questions became more pointed and frequent. She wanted specifics about household rules, disciplinary approaches, even marriage details that didn't relate to Jacob's well-being. Did we argue in front of him? Did I have friends over when he was home? Did we maintain appropriate boundaries about adult conversations around children? My friends thought I was being oversensitive when I mentioned feeling judged. Rachel from work said all divorced parents went through adjustment periods with new partners. My sister suggested Laura would eventually relax once she realized I wasn't undermining her relationship with her son. Everyone said it wasn't a big deal. Blended families always required time and adjustment, but the constant questioning was affecting my confidence and making me feel under surveillance in my own home. The situation reached a breaking point when Laura started calling Jacob directly to ask detailed questions about his day, meals, activities, and emotions while he was supposed to be enjoying time with his father's family. These calls lasted 30 to 45 minutes and left him feeling interrogated and anxious about providing the right answers. I watched him pace our kitchen one evening, phone pressed to his ear, carefully explaining what he'd eaten for dinner and whether he'd finished homework before watching TV. When he hung up, he looked exhausted and worried, like he'd completed a difficult exam rather than talk to someone who loved him. That's when I realized Laura's need to monitor and control wasn't just affecting me. It was putting tremendous pressure on Jacob to be a perfect child who never gave his mother reason to worry about his care in our home. All I wanted was to love this kid and help him feel secure in our blended family. Somehow it became a careful dance around someone else's insecurities. Receipt number 1 was small but hard to ignore when I found Jacob crying in his room after a weekend visit. He'd mentioned that I'd been teaching him basic cooking: scrambled eggs, grilled cheese, simple pasta. Michael and I thought these were valuable life skills. We'd started because Jacob showed interest in dinner prep, and I enjoyed our one-on-one kitchen time talking through whatever was on his mind. But when Jacob enthusiastically told his mother about making his favorite breakfast alone, Laura responded with tears. She'd always planned to teach him those recipes when he was older. Now those special mother-child moments were ruined because I'd gotten there first. She'd explained that certain experiences belong to mothers and children. By learning these skills from me instead of waiting for her, he'd taken something precious from their relationship. Jacob was devastated that he'd accidentally hurt his mother by developing independence. Through his tears, he asked if he should pretend not to know how to make eggs so his mom could still teach him, or if he should stop cooking with me to avoid more conflicts. This 11-year-old was trying to manage adult emotions and protect everyone's feelings by limiting his own growth. He felt guilty for enjoying our time together because his mother made him feel like his development was somehow betraying their relationship. When Michael called Laura to discuss this, she turned it around on us. If I was really concerned about Jacob's well-being, I'd be more careful about not encroaching on experiences that belonged to his real parent. Cooking lessons were intimate bonding activities reserved for biological mothers and children. The word real stung more than I wanted to admit. Receipt number 2 made denial harder when Jacob started asking questions that revealed his confusion and anxiety about family dynamics. He wanted to know if loving me meant he loved his mom less, as if affection were finite and had to be rationed between competing adults. He wondered if enjoying time with me made his mom sad, and whether he should feel guilty about looking forward to our grocery trips or evening neighborhood walks. He asked if I'd still be his stepmom if his parents got back together, seeming genuinely worried I might disappear if family circumstances changed. When I assured him Michael and I were married permanently, he seemed relieved, but then asked if that meant his mom would always be sad about not having the family she used to have. These weren't questions a kid should ask. They showed that Laura's emotional reactions were creating deep anxiety about his place in both households and his right to form natural bonds with caring adults. The most heartbreaking question came on a quiet Sunday morning while we made pancakes. Out of nowhere, he asked if his mom would be happier if I wasn't part of their family anymore, and whether Michael would understand if I moved away to make things easier for everyone. This child was contemplating sacrificing relationships that brought him joy and stability to manage an adult's emotional reactions to circumstances beyond his control. Michael was getting frustrated too, but reluctant to create more conflict that might affect their custody arrangement. He'd heard stories about ex-spouses using parental alienation tactics when threatened, and worried about making things worse by confronting Laura too aggressively. But something had to change when Jacob started having physical anxiety symptoms around custody exchanges. Stomach aches the morning he was supposed to go to his mom's house, withdrawn behavior the day before transitions between households, clearly anxious about navigating emotional landmines around simple family interactions. I suggested maybe I should step back from certain activities until Laura felt more secure. Michael was strongly against this, arguing that rewarding her unreasonable behavior with concessions would only encourage escalation and teach Jacob that love was dangerous and had to be hidden. We were caught in an impossible situation. Receipt number 3 ended the debate about whether Laura's behavior was normal when she showed up at Jacob's school unannounced to check on his academic progress during a week when he was with us. The teacher was confused because Laura wasn't supposed to have custody that week, and Michael hadn't authorized any school visits. When the school called to verify Laura was allowed to meet with Jacob's teacher, they discovered she'd been calling regularly to ask about his behavior, grades, and social interactions during periods when he was in our care. She'd also been asking teachers whether Jacob ever mentioned me, what he said about our household, and whether his academic performance differed during weeks with his dad versus weeks with her. The school counselor called Michael to express concern that Jacob was being put in the middle of adult conflicts. They'd noticed he seemed anxious about discussing home life and was reluctant to mention activities involving me, even in casual contexts. This was when I realized Laura wasn't just insecure about my relationship with Jacob. She was actively monitoring and questioning his interactions with me through third parties, treating our household like a hostile environment needing supervision and control. Michael was furious about the unauthorized visits and calls. He called his lawyer about modifying their custody agreement to include provisions about school communication and boundaries around monitoring Jacob's life in both households. But before legal action could be taken, I discovered something that changed everything I thought I knew about the situation. I was cleaning out Michael's home office to surprise him by organizing his paperwork when I found a folder folder labeled custody documents that had fallen behind his filing cabinet. Inside were legal papers I'd never seen before. Not just the divorce decree I knew about, but correspondence between lawyers that dated back to before Michael and I had even met. The papers revealed that Laura had tried to get primary custody of Jacob during their original divorce proceedings. She'd argued that Michael's work schedule and frequent business travel made him an unsuitable primary parent, and that Jacob would be better served living with her full-time with Michael getting standard visitation rights. But here's what made my blood run cold. Michael had counter-argued that Laura was emotionally unstable and had been seeing a therapist for what his lawyer described as possessive and controlling behaviors regarding the child that were affecting the minor's emotional development. The documents included a psychological evaluation that Laura had been required to undergo as part of the custody proceedings. The evaluator had noted concerns about her difficulty accepting that the child could form healthy attachments to other caregivers, and recommended that the mother would benefit from continued therapy to address anxiety and control issues that may interfere with co-parenting relationships. There were pages of documented incidents where Laura had become disproportionately upset about normal childhood activities, Jacob enjoying time with babysitters, forming friendships with classmates whose parents she didn't know, even bonding with his preschool teacher. The evaluator had specifically noted that Laura seemed to view any positive relationship in Jacob's life as a threat to her maternal bond. Most shocking of all was a letter from Laura's own therapist to the court, stating that while Laura was a loving mother, she struggled with abandonment fears stemming from her own childhood experiences that manifested as attempts to control and limit her child's relationships with others. Michael had never told me any of this. The final document in the folder was the most recent, a letter from Laura's current attorney to Michael's lawyer, dated just 3 weeks earlier. It outlined a new strategy for challenging our custody arrangement, but this time with a different approach. Instead of claiming Michael was unfit, they were planning to argue that I was creating parental alienation by encouraging Jacob to view me as a replacement mother figure. The letter detailed their plan to gather evidence of my inappropriate boundary violations, including testimony from school personnel, documentation of Jacob calling me mom, and expert witness testimony about the psychological damage caused when step-parents usurp the role of the biological parent. But the most devastating part was a handwritten note stapled to the back of the letter, apparently from Laura to her attorney. Lisa doesn't know that Jacob started calling her mom because I told him to. I suggested it during one of our phone calls, hoping she'd be stupid enough to encourage it instead of correcting him. Now we have proof that she's trying to replace me. I sat in Michael's office, staring at that note, trying to process what I was reading. Laura had manipulated her own son into calling me mom as part of a legal strategy to prove I was overstepping boundaries. Every time Jacob had called me mom, and I'd smiled or responded naturally, I'd been unknowingly participating in her trap. The innocent moments I'd treasured, when he'd run to me after a bad dream calling me mom, when he'd introduced me to his friends as my mom Lisa, when he'd written a Mother's Day card addressed to the best mom, had all been orchestrated by his biological mother as evidence against me. She'd been willing to confuse and manipulate her own child's emotions to build a legal case. My hands were shaking as I photographed every document in the folder. I needed Michael to explain why he'd hidden this from me, but I also needed evidence in case Laura tried to destroy the papers. When Michael came home that evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table with printouts of everything I'd found. "We need to talk," I said, sliding the documents across to him. His face went pale as he recognized what I'd discovered. "Lisa, I can explain. You knew she was manipulating Jacob into calling me mom. You knew she was building a legal case against me, and you didn't think I deserved to know any of this?" Michael sank into the chair across from me, looking older than I'd ever seen him. "I was trying to protect you," he said quietly. "If you'd known what she was doing, it would have changed how you acted around Jacob. You might have started correcting him or pulling away from him, which is exactly what she wanted. So instead, you let me walk around thinking I was building a genuine relationship with my stepson, when really I was being set up. Your relationship with Jacob is genuine," Michael said firmly. "What Laura suggested might have planted the seed, but Jacob's feelings for you are real. Kids don't fake the kind of attachment he has to you." "But how can I trust that? How can I trust any of it now?" Michael reached across the table and took my hands. "Because I've watched you two together for 2 years. I've seen how he lights up when you walk into a room, how he seeks you out when he's upset, how he talks about you to his friends. Laura might have suggested the word mom, but she didn't create his love for you." I pulled my hands away. "Why didn't you tell me about the custody evaluation? About her history of trying to control his relationships? Because I hoped things would be different with you." Her therapist said she was making progress, and I thought maybe having some distance and seeing Jacob happy in our home would help her accept that he could love more people without loving her less. But instead, she escalated into actively sabotaging our relationship. Yes, and I should have warned you what we were dealing with. I'm sorry. I stared at the documents spread across our table. "There's more, Michael. According to this letter, she's been planning a new custody challenge. She wants to claim I'm alienating Jacob from her." Michael's jaw tightened as he read the attorney's letter. "This is insane. Anyone who spends 5 minutes with Jacob can see that we encourage his relationship with his mother. But we don't have proof of that. We just have proof that her son calls me mom, which is apparently exactly what she wanted." The implications were staggering. Every natural moment between Jacob and me had been weaponized. Every time I'd responded positively to him calling me mom, I'd given Laura ammunition for her argument that I was trying to replace her. "What do we do now?" I asked. Michael was quiet for a long time, studying the papers. "We get our own attorney. We document everything. Her manipulation, her unauthorized school visits, her attempts to control Jacob's relationships, and we pray that a judge can see through her games." "But what about Jacob? How do we tell him that his mother has been using him as a pawn in a legal strategy?" "We don't," Michael said immediately. "He's 12 years old. He doesn't need to know that his mother manipulated him. It would destroy his trust in all of us." I understood Michael's reasoning, but keeping this secret felt like another form of manipulation. How could we have an honest relationship with Jacob while hiding something this significant about his mother's behavior? So we just pretend none of this happened? We protect Jacob from adult problems that aren't his responsibility to solve, Michael said. But we also prepare to defend our family against someone who's willing to use her own child as a weapon. The next few weeks were a nightmare of legal consultations and strategic planning. Our attorney, a woman named Patricia who specialized in high-conflict custody cases, reviewed Laura's history and shook her head grimly. This is parental alienation, she said, but not in the way she's claiming. She's the one who's been manipulating the child's emotions and relationships for her own purposes. Patricia explained that Laura's strategy was actually fairly common among parents who struggled with control issues. By encouraging Jacob to use maternal language with me, then claiming I was encouraging inappropriate boundaries, she could paint herself as the victim trying to protect her child from an overreaching step-parent. The problem is that proving manipulation is harder than proving the behavior she's complaining about, Patricia warned. A judge who doesn't understand the full context might see a child calling his stepmother mom and assume that represents boundary issues, regardless of how the behavior originated. We spent hours preparing our defense, documenting every positive interaction between Jacob and his mother, every way we'd supported their relationship, every attempt we'd made to include her in school events and activities. But I was struggling with how to act naturally around Jacob while knowing what I knew about Laura's manipulation. Every time he called me mom, I wondered if it was genuine affection or programmed behavior. Every sweet moment between us felt tainted by the knowledge that his mother had orchestrated it for strategic purposes. Michael noticed my increasing distance and confronted me about it. "You're pulling away from him," he said one evening after Jacob had gone to bed. "He's starting to notice, and it's confusing him." "I don't know what's real anymore," I admitted. "How do I respond naturally to him calling me mom when I know his mother told him to do it? Because even if she planted the idea, his feelings are still genuine. Look at how he acts around you, Lisa. Look at how he seeks you out when he's scared or upset. You can't fake that kind of emotional attachment." I wanted to believe Michael, but the doubt was eating away at my confidence in everything I thought I knew about my relationship with Jacob. Things came to a head the following weekend during one of Jacob's visits with Laura. He came home Sunday evening looking troubled and confused. "Mom wants me to stop calling you mom," he said to me directly, using the title that now made me flinch internally. "She said it hurts her feelings and makes her think I don't love her anymore." Michael and I exchanged glances. This was exactly what we'd been afraid of. Laura was now trying to undo the behavior she'd originally encouraged, putting Jacob in an impossible position. "What did you tell her?" I asked gently. "I told her that I love her and I love you too, and that calling you mom doesn't mean she's not my real mom." But she started crying and said that if I really loved her, I'd understand why it makes her sad. My heart broke for this kid who was being forced to manage adult emotions and navigate loyalty tests that even adults would find challenging. "What would make you feel most comfortable?" I asked him. Jacob thought about it for a moment. "I want to keep calling you mom because that's how I think of you, but I don't want to make her cry anymore." Michael knelt down to Jacob's eye level. "Buddy, the adults in your life are responsible for managing their own feelings. You don't have to change how you talk to people you love just to make someone else feel better. But what if she gets so sad that she doesn't want to be my mom anymore?" The fear in his voice was heartbreaking. Laura's manipulation had created a world where this child believed that his natural affections were dangerous to the adults around him. I made a decision in that moment that I'd been avoiding for weeks. "Jacob," I said, sitting down next to him, "I need you to know that no matter what you call me, Mom, Lisa, or anything else, it doesn't change how much I love you or how important you are to me. And your mother will always be your mother, no matter what anyone else does or says." "Really?" "Really. Adults sometimes have complicated feelings about sharing people they love, but that's our problem to work out, not yours." Jacob seemed relieved by this reassurance, but I could tell he was still carrying the weight of trying to keep everyone happy. That night, after Jacob was asleep, Michael and I had a long conversation about how to handle the situation going forward. "We have to tell him," I said finally. "Not everything, but something. He's carrying so much guilt and anxiety about his natural feelings, and he deserves to understand that he's not responsible for fixing adult problems." Michael was reluctant, but ultimately agreed that Jacob needed some age-appropriate explanation of why the adults in his life were having such strong reactions to normal family dynamics. The conversation we had with Jacob the next day was one of the hardest of my life. We explained in simple terms that sometimes when families change, adults need time to adjust to new relationships. We told him that his mother was worried about making sure he knew she would always be his mom, and that worry was making her sad when she heard him call other people mom, too. We assured him that having multiple people in his life who cared about him was a good thing, and that he never needed to hide his feelings or change how he expressed love to protect adult emotions. Most importantly, we told him that whatever happened with custody arrangements or legal issues, nothing would change the fact that both Michael and I were committed to being part of his life for as long as he wanted us there. Jacob listened carefully and asked a few questions, but seemed relieved to finally have some explanation for the tension he'd been sensing. "So it's not my fault that Mom gets sad when I call Lisa mom?" he asked. "It's absolutely not your fault," Michael said firmly. "Adults are responsible for their own feelings. And I don't have to choose between loving you and loving her. You never have to choose," I promised him. "Love isn't like pizza where there are only so many slices to go around. You can love as many people as you want without running out." For the first time in weeks, Jacob smiled a genuine, relaxed smile. But our relief was short-lived, because Laura's legal strategy was just getting started. That's when the blowback started. Even though we'd only tried to protect Jacob from adult drama, Laura found out Michael had spoken to his lawyer and immediately called to accuse us of trying to limit her access to her son. She threatened to petition for modified custody, claiming I was alienating Jacob from his mother, and Michael was allowing it by not setting appropriate boundaries. The accusations were devastating because they were backwards from reality. Laura was creating alienation by making Jacob feel guilty about caring for me, but she framed my presence as the problem rather than her reaction to it. She started reaching out to other people in Jacob's life, teachers, coaches, friends' parents, expressing concerns about his well-being during times with his father's family. She didn't make direct accusations, just asked leading questions about whether they'd noticed changes in his behavior that might indicate problems at home. People I trusted took her side without understanding the full situation. Jacob's soccer coach mentioned to Michael that Laura seemed really concerned about things going on at our house, suggesting maybe we all needed to communicate better. My own mother started asking careful questions about whether I was moving too fast in assuming a parental role. She'd heard from someone in Laura's extended family that there were boundary concerns and wanted to make sure I wasn't putting Jacob in an uncomfortable position. Even Michael's parents began making subtle suggestions about being sensitive to blended family complexities and respecting the biological parents' feelings. Jacob could sense the tension even when adults tried hiding it. He started walking on eggshells around me, clearly afraid that showing affection would cause more problems with his mom. I felt like I was being erased from his life to appease someone else's insecurity. Annoying turned expensive when Laura hired a family law attorney and filed for modified custody, claiming Jacob's best interests weren't being served in an environment where inappropriate parental boundaries were maintained. She wasn't seeking to reduce Michael's custody time, just required that I have limited involvement in parenting decisions and that all school communication go through her as primary parent. She wanted court-ordered family counseling to address what her lawyer called parental role confusion and loyalty conflicts, allegedly harming Jacob's emotional development. Now it wasn't just hurt feelings or awkward dynamics. It was legal fees, court hearings, and the possibility that our family structure could be legally restricted based on one person's inability to accept that her child could love more than one maternal figure. The custody evaluation process was grueling. A court-appointed psychologist interviewed each adult separately, observed interactions between Jacob and both parents, reviewed school records and communications, and ultimately had to decide whether my presence was beneficial or harmful. I sat in a sterile office explaining to a stranger why I loved my stepson, how I'd tried supporting his relationship with his mother, and whether I understood the difference between being a step-parent and trying to replace his biological parent. Meanwhile, Jacob was being asked about loyalty and preference that no child should have to answer. Did he love his mom more than me? Did he wish I wasn't part of his life? Did he feel pressured to choose between adults who cared for him? The evaluation ultimately found no evidence I was harmful to Jacob's well-being. In fact, the psychologist noted that Jacob seemed more anxious when discussing his relationship with me than other life aspects, suggesting he'd been taught to feel conflicted about caring for his stepmother. The court denied Laura's petition and recommended family counseling to help all adults support Jacob's relationships with everyone who loved him. But winning in court didn't solve the underlying problem. And then I found the one thing I wasn't supposed to see that changed everything. Jacob had left his journal on the kitchen counter after a school assignment, and it fell open to a page where he'd written about his biggest worry. In his careful 11-year-old handwriting, "I'm scared that if I love Lisa too much, Mom won't want to be my mom anymore. But I'm also scared that if I don't love Lisa enough, Dad will be sad, and she'll leave like Mom left Dad." The entry continued with heartbreaking details about how he tried managing everyone's emotions, showing different levels of affection depending on who was watching, carefully monitoring his own feelings to make sure he wasn't hurting anyone by caring too much or too little. This child was living in constant anxiety about whether his love for adults was acceptable or dangerous. He was 11 and felt responsible for managing adult relationships and protecting everyone's feelings at the expense of his own emotional authenticity. After that, everything shifted in my perspective about what needed to happen, which brings me to that science fair night that forced everything into the open. I went in calmer than I felt to Jacob's 6th grade science fair, where he was presenting a renewable energy project we'd worked on together over several weeks. Michael was coming straight from work to meet us there, but I arrived early to help Jacob set up and calm his presentation nerves. Laura was already there when we arrived, chatting with other parents and photographing Jacob's project. She greeted us politely but coolly, the way she'd been doing since the custody battle ended. Jacob seemed tense, clearly aware of adult undercurrents but trying to focus on his big night. I led with the simplest approach, supporting Jacob's success while minimizing drama that might affect his evening. I stayed in the background while he explained his project to judges, took photos when Laura wasn't already taking them, and tried to be present without creating any appearance of competition. Everything was going well until one judge asked about his inspiration for choosing renewable energy. Without thinking about who was listening, he launched into an enthusiastic explanation about how I'd shown him documentaries about climate change and helped him understand the science behind solar and wind power. "My mom really helped me understand how important this stuff is for my generation," he said, gesturing toward me with obvious pride and affection. The word mom hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Laura's face went white, then red, then crumpled into pure devastation. Other parents listening to Jacob's presentation looked confused, glancing between Laura and me as they tried figuring out family dynamics. Jacob realized his mistake immediately and looked panic-stricken, his excitement about his project completely destroyed by one innocent word. Laura excused herself and walked quickly toward the bathroom. I could see her shoulders shaking as she left. I followed to make sure she was okay and found her sobbing in the hallway. When she saw me, grief transformed into anger. "How could you let this happen?" she demanded through tears. "He's my son. I'm his mother. You can't just take that away from me." I tried explaining I'd never asked Jacob to call me mom, that it wasn't something we'd planned or encouraged, but Laura was beyond listening. She accused me of deliberately undermining her relationship, of stealing moments and milestones that belonged to her, of confusing him about who his real family was. "He's been calling you mom behind my back, hasn't he?" she said. "You've been letting him think of you as his mother instead of teaching him that I'm the only one who deserves that title." The accusation was partially true. Jacob had started calling me mom occasionally when we were alone, and I hadn't corrected him because it felt natural and sweet. But I'd never encouraged it or made it a requirement, and certainly never intended for it to happen in front of Laura. I apologized for her pain and tried reassuring her that I understood she was Jacob's mother, and nothing would ever change that. But my words seemed to make her more upset, as if my attempts at comfort were further evidence I was trying to take her place. The confrontation lasted about 20 minutes, with Laura alternating between tears and anger, while I tried finding some way to make things better. Other parents were starting to notice, and I worried about how it would affect Jacob if the scene continued in such a public space. Finally, Michael arrived and found us in the hallway. Laura immediately turned to him and demanded he do something about the situation, make me understand I was overstepping boundaries and hurting their son by allowing him to see me as a replacement mother. Michael tried calming everyone down and suggested we continue the conversation privately after the science fair, but Laura wasn't willing to wait. She wanted immediate assurance that I would stop allowing Jacob to call me mom, and that we'd establish clearer boundaries about my role. I found myself agreeing to ask Jacob to use my first name instead of mom, especially when his mother was present, just to de-escalate and get us through the rest of his school event. Michael looked unhappy with this concession, but didn't contradict me in front of Laura. We returned to the science fair and managed to get through the rest of the evening, but the damage was done. Jacob was quiet and subdued, clearly upset that his moment of pride had turned into family drama. Laura stayed on the opposite side of the room from me, and Michael seemed frustrated with everyone involved. When we got home that night, Jacob was furious with me for agreeing to Laura's demand about the name issue. "Why do you care more about her feelings than about me?" he asked, tears streaming down his face. "I thought you loved me, but now you're saying I can't even call you what feels right because it makes her sad." Michael was equally upset, arguing that I'd essentially validated Laura's position that my relationship with Jacob was inappropriate or threatening. He felt like I'd thrown our family under the bus to appease his unreasonable ex-wife, and that I'd taught Jacob his feelings mattered less than adult politics. But I was thinking about that journal entry I'd seen, about a little boy who felt responsible for managing everyone's emotions and protecting all the adults in his life. I wondered if asking him to modify how he addressed me in certain situations was actually protecting him from impossible loyalty conflicts. The conversation went late into the night, with all three of us exhausted and emotional by the end. It didn't look like TV justice, but something important had shifted in our family dynamics that night. We couldn't go back to pretending that Laura's insecurity wasn't affecting Jacob's ability to form natural relationships with people who loved him. Here's what actually changed. Michael called Laura the next day and told her that while he understood her feelings about the mom situation, he wouldn't allow her discomfort to limit Jacob's relationships or force him to hide his affections to protect adult egos. He explained that Jacob calling me mom sometimes was his choice, not something we'd encouraged or required, and that trying to control how he expressed feelings would only create more anxiety and confusion. He offered family counseling sessions that included all of us, but made it clear that any future attempts to legally limit my involvement in Jacob's life would be met with strong opposition. Laura initially resisted, but the custody evaluation had made it clear her previous tactics weren't successful, and that continued conflict would only hurt Jacob more. She reluctantly agreed to try counseling, though she maintained she'd never be comfortable with Jacob calling anyone else mom. The counseling sessions were difficult but eventually productive. Laura was able to acknowledge that her fears about being replaced came from her own childhood experiences with divorce and step-parents, and that projecting those fears onto Jacob wasn't fair to him. I was able to explain that I'd never intended to compete with her or minimize her importance in Jacob's life, and that I was willing to be more mindful about situations that might trigger her insecurity while still maintaining authentic relationships with him. Most importantly, Jacob learned that he didn't have to manage adult emotions or hide his feelings to keep peace in the family. He was allowed to love all of us in whatever way felt natural to him, and the adults in his life were responsible for working out their own issues without putting him in the middle. Now, 2 years later, Jacob still calls me mom sometimes and Lisa other times, depending on the situation and how he's feeling. Laura still gets uncomfortable when it happens in front of her, but she doesn't make him feel guilty about it anymore. Michael and I have learned to support Jacob's relationship with his mother, while also maintaining our own family bonds. The science fair project, which started this whole crisis, won second place in the school district competition. Jacob was proud of his achievement and proud that all three of his parents were there to celebrate with him, even if the dynamics were complicated. We're not a perfect blended family, but we're a functional one where a child gets to experience multiple sources of love without having to choose between them. Laura will always be Jacob's mother, and nothing will ever change that. But I'm also part of his family now, and I've earned the right to be called whatever feels authentic to him in our relationship. He calls me mom because he wants to, not because anyone taught him to.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and drop your favorite part in the comments. See you in the next one.